Death can often seem remote to us, particularly but not exclusively for those of us who are young college students. And should we leave it that way, or should we be grappling with this concept of and the reality of our death, and why?
I'll start with that. I think that we can draw an important distinction that comes through very clearly in the phenomenologist philosophers who wrote about death, and that's the difference between having death in the background of your consciousness and having death in the foreground of your consciousness. So the foreground of your consciousness, it's a theme, it's what you're focused on, it's what you're thinking about. And so when we ask, should I think about it or should I go about my business, we're asking, should I have it as a theme, as a topic? Should I be focusing my attention on it? Whereas the question of whether it should be in the background of consciousness, it isn't even a question, because it always is in the background of consciousness, or so these philosophers, I think, compellingly argue. So in what way is it in the background of consciousness? And here's where things get complicated, but I think they can be explained, which is that if you think about anything you do, any activity takes time, but any activity has a temporal arc to it. So having a calling, that is a temporal arc of a life. Going to college, that has a temporal arc with a sort of endpoint, natural endpoint. It has completion conditions when you finish college. Looking at an artwork or reading a great book, or poem, or philosophy or something, that has no natural endpoint, but has a temporal arc nonetheless. It doesn't end, but it structures your activity so long as you're doing it. And then those are sort of, anything you do has this temporal structure, and our sense of what we're in the course of doing, what we're in the middle of doing, what we're finishing doing, those are extraordinarily orienting for our lives at all sorts of levels. So if you think about, you're getting ready to go out to a movie with a friend, and you know how some people take a long time to get ready? Some people take less time to get ready. And if you're friends with someone, you hope that you're temporally compatible. Otherwise, it gets annoying if you're taking too long, because we walk around with a sense of how long certain activities should take. So I'm trying to give you these mundane but also grand examples so that you can see how it's completely unavoidable to have temporal structures orienting anything you do that has meaning, whether it's a mundane thing like going to the movies or a life-orienting thing like having a calling. Okay, so now what does that have to do with death? Well, what death does is it disrupts all temporal orientations, because in death there is no more temporal orientation. You are, that is the end. There is nothing more to orient you. And that is why it is so terrifying. That is why everybody checks no on Dr. Dugdale's box. Because we sense, we know, we feel intuitively how disorienting and disruptive it is to think about that. And that fact can be exploited and is exploited in politics sometimes. If you force people to think about death by imposing possibilities of violence all the time, you can manipulate their fears, you can disorient them, you can paralyze them, you can make them feel, I have to just do this immediate thing because, this thing is looming over me. So what should you think about? Now, people your age who are sort of rightly focused on futurity and on your role in determining what are these temporal arcs going to be, should you think about death, we can use our distinction to disambiguate between, should I thematize it and think about it all the time? Should I have it in the background? Have it in the background, it already is. Thematize it? No, don't thematize it. Don't think about your death. Don't, because you're already answering to it by focusing on the values that are shaping your decisions about what you're actually going to do. So in a way, you're already answering to the fact of your mortality just by asking the questions about what is worth it for you to do, what is valuable for you to do, and why.
So then there's this next question, which is that as a doc, I don't meet very many patients for whom death is in the background in a way that actually gives shape to their lives. So I'm going to push back a little bit. And I know you're the philosopher, and what am I? But how is it, so you look at your average, 20-year-old, 21-year-old, and most of these folks are not really living life, making decisions based on what if they died next week, right? So even folks who are quite advanced in age in our culture still aren't living with death in the background in a way. So whether we want to say it's in the background or the foreground, it doesn't seem to be having an impact. And I would say that when we do think about death, it should bring into relief that which we matter most, right? If I am a finite creature, then there is a certain urgency, even if there's an afterlife. If I'm finite in this life, there's a certain urgency to living intentionally into every day in light of my finiteness. But I have to keep that in view, and I don't think people really do, whether foreground or background.
Good. Okay, so let me clarify what I meant by background. Because I think there are different things one can mean by that. So, if you have a sort of dull pain all day, that's sort of in the background, and then once in a while you notice it, but it's always sort of there. If you're in a bad mood, that can be sort of in the background. When I talk about awareness of death in the background, and the way that I think these philosophers and Rilke, and a nice poem that maybe we'll have a chance to read some of, what they're talking about, I don't think it's a background in that sense. It's not like a mood. It's not like a thought that you're carrying around with you, or an after feeling of a conversation. You sort of have a nice conversation in the morning. This happens to me when I walk my dog, because it's great to walk a dog and say hi to this person and that person, and then sort of just feel good. And that's in the background of other things that I do. But that's not what they're talking about. What they are talking about is something more abstract. They're talking about the very fact of having any temporal orientation at all. And how people think about the temporal structure of their lives is very different at different ages. So when they talk about death being in the background, all they are talking about is this very fundamental thing, that if you have any temporal structure to how you're thinking about your life or your projects, that is having death in the background. It's backgrounded because if it was foregrounded, you wouldn't even, it would all be meaningless. Your temporal structure would be meaningless and your activities would be meaningless. And that's why when people during the pandemic talked about, I lost my sense of time, I had this sort of sense of doom coming over me as this looming thing. I didn't know what was happening. I felt paralyzed. There were people dying all around me. I didn't know if that might happen to me, if that might happen to somebody I love. People's sense of time got all distorted then because their sense of meaning got distorted. So having it in the background, it's maybe a misleading, it can be misleading if we think of that on the model of like a mood or something, because I completely agree with what you're saying. It's my sense as well that, let's hope, maybe some of you, if you're particularly interested in it, will have it in the background of your mind in the way you were describing. But when they're talking about having it in the background, it really is a sort of basic structuring fact. So anybody who has any sense of themselves in time, whether it's making mistakes like the demented person, or only seeing the sort of now and the day, that's all that matters of the young child, or whether it's the 20-something person who's sort of thinking everything I do right now is going to decide these very, very important things for a long time to come. Those are all different ways of having death in the background, because they're all different ways of thinking of your life as having a temporal structure.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess, so one more question on this point. Does the threat of death, your description of COVID and people dying all around, does it matter if death results in nothingness? I mean, that is, if death were a threshold to something better, does that negate kind of what the philosophers are saying? I'm trying to use your language, but I can't really, so I need you to meet me halfway, or 60%.
I see what you're saying. So I've been talking as if everything of meaning happens in this earthly temporality. But if you rejected that idea and you thought, actually, there was all these, even truly more wonderful things happening, however wonderful this is, which might be wonderful, that's even better on the other side, then perhaps we should become indifferent to death, or perhaps we should, think, well, this was good, but then that will also be good. And that gives us a kind of peace and equanimity. So I guess, let me say, and does that force a sort of is that outlook incompatible with this idea of death as a horizon beyond which there's a sort of abyss or a nothingness or just a pure negation? Okay, I understand the question and the challenge. I think it's compatible with it in the sense of, so long as we can preserve a sort of, difference in kind between whatever kind of life or temporality there might be afterward, and whatever there is now, I think that we could still face a loss of, the earthly temporality here. And getting back to the kind of political dimension of it, one thing that can be sort of weaponized or abused in that line of thought you sketched, about, well, just meet it with equanimity, it's really not so bad. I think that's a valuable thing for people, a valuable perspective for people to have that people really rely on, importantly, when they come to it themselves. But when it's imposed on you, or when they say, well, herd immunity, or you were old anyway, or, well, you died, but okay. And you meet it with a shrug and a sigh, that I think is terrible. That I think is something we should resist if we find ourselves in the midst of political discourse that relies on that. I think that's cruelty, and that's a negation of a realm of meaning that should not be imposed on us. But I don't want to conflate those things. It's everything. No, we often find ideas, frames that are very good, but also can be abused. You find that all the time. And this is just an example of that.
So I've been lecturing a lot lately on physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, and particularly with the Canadian context, medical assistance in dying, where more than 10,000 people were euthanized last year in Canada, 1,721 for loneliness, 537 folks with disabilities who weren't able to have their disability needs met in Canada elected euthanasia. So as a physician, this is an issue that's coming more and more to the fore. And so when I read your really wonderful piece in the Harvard Gazette, I started thinking about even my own work differently, because you write, and I think this is where you were going with your remarks just now, you're quoted as talking about the need for political leaders to approach conversations about death with a sort of gravitas, right? With a sobriety, that the dignity of human life, in a sense, you don't use that language, but that it demands, right? That human life demands that we talk about death in a way that is very respectful. And that if we don't do that, we lose something. And then I was thinking, wow, I do all this work on the preparation for death. We need to talk about death. We don't have to arrive at equanimity. We can be afraid sort of all the way. I read about this. Some people are afraid sort of all the way through. But we need to keep death in the conversation. And yet, there's a way in which if death is too much in the conversation, it gets cheapened. And then life is cheapened. And even people who are in favor of legalization of physician-assisted suicide in the United States are a little bit nervous about what's going on in Canada right now. And so I wonder if you would just indulge me for a second and reflect on the kind of Canadian experiment. And one other point on this, we know that in jurisdictions where physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia are legal, there is a concomitant increase in conventional suicide. So that is what's happening, right? The conversation about death and being able to take one's own life, whether it's doctor sanctioned, state sanctioned, or you do it yourself, that becomes so ubiquitous. Why would you not? And so I just wonder, so I found myself struggling as I was thinking through reading your piece and thinking about this talk. Well, how do we, or where is the line? I want my patients to prepare for death. I want the students to think about their mortality. They'll make different decisions. If you know that time is limited, and you just even reflect on that for a second, you'll make different decisions about why you live and what you do and what matters. You just will. So I think that's a good, but we also don't want to sort of slip over the line where life then becomes disposable at a whim. And the public conversation, sort of from the top down, is one where that's okay. They're elderly, and you know what? It saves healthcare dollars, right? And that is what we're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a kind of callousness when the decision is made. The decision is made for you. I think those are the clearest cases of callousness. The hard cases, and we did see that in the pandemic. And people should rightly take offense or feel indignant if the people, if a government that's supposed to be, in charge of our safety and protecting us, suddenly treats us as if we are dispensable, then that's government not doing its basic job of governing. Now, the hard cases are this line of thought you're mentioning, which is, suppose you have sort of the affordance or the possibility of doing something, and then, it becomes an option on the radar that might not have been there if it was illegal. And I don't know what to think about that. One reaction I do have, though, is that when I think about where in the public sphere, in the range of different political phenomena that we face, where do we find the most powerful forces that are cheapening life? It strikes me that it's not in medical health policy or assisted suicide. It strikes me that it's in political move. It strikes me that it's in gun violence, to be frank, where we're just supposed to take it. We're just supposed to say, well, another school shooting, I guess your kindergartner is going to have to learn how to hide under the desk because that's the price of somebody else exercising their freedom. You're just going to have to die. To me, that is, an epidemic. It's a political problem. That's where I see the cheapening of life in a much larger scale than these health policy things. But I completely take the point that it's an extremely difficult question. I'm glad we have ethicists like you working at it of, what should we think about? And of course, people say similar things about abortion. If it's a possibility, then will people sort of think of it the wrong way or whatever? And one thing I guess I will say about both of those cases is that at least there are structures, where there's discussion, where there's reflection. Nobody takes those things lightly. Nobody does, and nobody really can. So the threat that people are going to cheapen it just because this policy is available, I feel that that's a sort of distorted abstraction in a way. Whereas like someone might barge into Michigan State or Cambridge or someplace else and take someone's life just because, for whatever reason, because they can. And when we ask these questions of what was their motive, as opposed to asking how could they do it, how was it possible, why was it possible for that to happen? To me, that's a sort of bigger threat. Now, that's not an answer to the question, and I don't like it sometimes when people say you're asking this question, but what about that question? But I do think that sometimes if we're trying to assess where should we focus our attention if we're worried about cheapening of life, then I think it is fair to say we should focus on, gun violence or the politics of strong men who try to stoke fear and then say only I can protect you from it, more than we should focus on health policy. When we are focusing on health policy, we should make sure that whenever we're adjacent to death, wherever we're adjacent to questions about life, we have the supports we need for people to think it through and come to it clear-eyed and come to it with people like you, doctors like you, who are, not just sort of treating the body, but treating the human situation.
Yeah,
that's how I think of it.
Now, how does finitude that death provides give meaning to our life, and how should it shape or inform the things that we value and choose to do? And that can start with either one.
You start with this one because I already said a thing about this.
So any of you who have known someone who's had a bad diagnosis starts thinking about their life very differently, right? I have a best friend from childhood. We've been very close since the age of 10. And on Super Bowl Sunday, she texted me to say, I'm in the intensive care unit. I'm not sure what's going to happen. She's not touchy-feely, lovey-dovey at all. But she said, just in case I die, I want you to know that I love you. And that's, to hear from her, something that I've never heard her say before, also sort of made it clear to me that she was in a bad way. And she had some major health stuff. And fortunately, I think is going to be okay. But those diagnoses, those moments, those kind of wake-up calls, put things into perspective. And I don't think we want to go through life, maybe unless you're a poet, hoping for drama and tragedy so that you kind of constantly put your life in focus, right? I don't know that we want to wish for that, but is there a way that we can kind of have the end in view and make better decisions? So I don't know how many of you realized that yesterday was Ash Wednesday. Did you see some people with like the smudges? So I I went to Ash Wednesday service last night. I'm a practicing Christian, and went to Ash Wednesday service. And the liturgy is kind of all doom and gloom, right? I mean, it's a lot of doom and gloom. Death to sin, death to self. It's really all about death. And why is it all about death? Well, it's only all about death because it's the preparation for Christians for the 40 days of fasting and sort of restitution as they approach Easter. That's what Lent is about. And Ash Wednesday is kind of the kickoff. That's why you have Fat Tuesday or Mardi Gras on Tuesday, right? Party, party, party. And then, the ashes and death and this season of preparation. So I was sitting there last night thinking, I probably should have been listening to the priest, but I was thinking about tonight's event and thinking, if there's no resurrection, right, this is pretty bad. Why would you have a day set aside, from dust you came, to dust you will return? You are mortal, you're human, you are going to turn into ash, and then have the ash smudged on your forehead, and then I got it on my fingernails. And why would you do that if there's no resurrection? And so then, I was just kind of thinking about what does death make clear for us? Because if there's nothing, then it can be total. I mean, it is always disruptive, as you said really eloquently, Susanna. But yeah. So I mean, in my book, I was really taken. There's a professor here at Harvard, John Levinson, who writes on Jewish conceptions of the resurrection in the first century. This was before Christians came on the scene and had their conception of the resurrection. But there was this conception of the resurrection that in the last days, all of the faithful will be resurrected. And there's some disagreement among the first century Jewish leaders. Is it all the Jewish faithful, or is there going to be a general resurrection of the dead of everybody? And then you have Jesus, the Jewish man, dies and is resurrected, and that sort of turns on the Christian accounting, right? That sort of turns the tables on what this conception of the resurrection is. But anyway, if there's nothing, I once was in conversation with a philosopher at Yale, Shelley Kagan. Do you know Shelley? Yeah, and he's like, the body is like a lamp. When it's broken, it's done, right? You're done. Throw it away. And I love him. He's so great. He's so great. But that's a different way to think about it. And is that okay? Does that give us peace? Yeah. Anyway, I don't know. I'll
Can
stop.
I say something about this?
Oh, please.
So, okay, I think one doesn't, I'm a philosopher for a living, which is amazing. I'm so grateful that I get to be a philosopher for a living. But even a philosopher for a living, like nobody, not even a philosophy professor, spends all their time reflecting. Nobody does that. It's like you reflect and then you engage for a little while, and then you reflect and you engage for a little while. So when we talk about bringing death out of the background, there's two very, very different ways to do that. And I think they've both emerged in different things you said tonight. So one sort of way you do it is like to have the frank conversations about practicalities and emotions that come up when somebody is thinking about the end of their life, at the end of somebody else's life, who they love, who they know. That's one way to bring it to the foreground. Another different way of bringing it to the foreground is potentially more disruptive, and almost kind of pulls in the opposite direction, but it's a stepping stone to reflection. Your friend texted you, she made explicit something that had only been implicit. So death, the prospect of it, was an occasion for reflection and expression. But we're not constantly, and there are other stepping stones to the same thing. An ethics class, a frank talk with a friend, a dream, a sort of quiet sitting where you're talking, as D.H. Lawrence says in one part, talking to a skeleton. There's a great little essay by D.H. Lawrence called Talking to My Skeleton. And he's like, why do people not want to talk to their skeleton? And it's anyway just about sort of, reflection. Now, we don't live our lives like reflecting all the time. We have various occasions on which things come into focus. And what should come into focus in those moments is what we care about, what we value. Sometimes when one is an existential crisis or a crisis of value, they ask what they value, but they are not sure what it is, and they don't sure how to figure out what it is, and they're have to figure out what can guide me in thinking it through. And then there are various things they can try to help with that. But those are moments of reflection that you go through. They're uncomfortable, but you go through that so that then you can stop reflecting and go about your business. And so, the idea that death shouldn't always be in the foreground is partly the idea that it might be a stepping stone to reflection, but you're not always reflecting. It's not like you should sort of constantly be thinking, oh my God, I'm going to die there for this. It's more that you do that so that you come to a settled idea of how to live. And so it's a kind of, and you don't have to, that's not the only way to come to that idea. You don't have to do it via death, but you can do it via death. And that's sort of different way of doing it via death than talking about practicalities. Perhaps talking about, do you want that? Would you like a gravesite next to me on my left or my right? Or your box or whatever. That's probably not going to lead to the occasion for reflection, whereas your friend's situation is.
Yeah, actually, one of our attendees also asked, quote, I've wondered about death before and what it would be like if I died and how. It's scary to me, the idea of inexistence, of literally losing my consciousness into oblivion, never to be reclaimed again. And my heart literally plummets when I think about this. I suppose I'd like to know how we can overcome this fear of death. And on that vein, of course, death is just not just an academic subject, but very deeply personal to all of us, and often scary to think about. How do you, as individuals, process the reality of your own death? Mortality.
Two questions there. So one question was, if I think about death, that the person who wrote in, and I hope you're here, hi, whoever you are, who said, it's a sort of oblivion and that's terrifying. How could I not be terrified? I would say you should be terrified. That is terrifying. But understand the terms of the terror, the terms of the fear. The terms of the fear is, what would you be losing? What are you losing in losing that? You are losing all of the things that give your meaning. You're losing all of your temporal structures and everything that can fill those structures. And that is terrifying. And the way to face it is not to lose the terror or not to say, oh, it's not such a big deal. But the way to lose it is to figure out, well, how do I want to fill those structures? With what do I want to fill those structures? If you think of it in terms of calling, what was I put on earth to do? Or what should I do? And how should I act? And how do I want to be in relationship with people? So it's a stepping stone again. And it won't lose the terror, it won't lose the fear. But another thing one can leverage in facing that fear is understanding the kinds of losses that other people have when people they are close to die, or when someone's left on the sidewalk, what it means that someone leaves the body on the sidewalk, for several hours before doing anything about it, and what kind of civic disregard that is. So that's a way of appreciating a value of life through that fear. So I think that's valuable. There was a second question, but I'll let you speak your first question first.
Sure. I hope, I'm not sure if you were saying that we should try to find a calling, if part of what you said was we should try to find a calling that could displace the fear, because I don't think we want to displace it. I think we want to hang out in that space.
Right.
So I quote one poet, Chris Wyman, who talks about walking toward the fear and sadness. There's a way in which when we hang out with things that fundamentally make us uncomfortable, we start seeing them in a new way. It doesn't mean the fear goes away completely, but it might make us reassess the situation. I think this is true with people that you think you really aren't going to like, right? You see that person and they did something really weird, and then you find yourself in a study group with them, right? We've had these experiences, but the more you sort of sit with that person, you realize their humanity, their quirkiness, what makes them tick, right? And I think there's a way in which that experience can be true with death. At least, there's so much to say. Very quickly, in California, when they legalized physician-assisted suicide, they gave, one study gave people the option, people who wanted lethal drugs to end their lives, half of them had the option of being able to speak with a licensed clinical social worker about their death anxiety. So one half got to counseling, and the other half just got to talk to the doctor and get the drugs. And of those who talked about their death anxiety, half of them left without wanting any further lethal drugs. What they really wanted was to be able to talk about their fears. So there's a way in which when things make us uncomfortable, if we kind of approximate ourselves to them, they become a little less scary. But I think there also raises the possibility of asking, this is a space for reflection and not action, then maybe, like, what is making me uncomfortable? Am I settled in my views of death? Like, am I a convinced materialist that actually my body is like a lamp? When I'm dead, I'm done. You can throw me out in the trash. Am I convinced, or is my discomfort because I'm not settled on my metaphysical sort of perspectives on death, right? And so I think that discomfort can open up, when we approximate ourselves to that discomfort, to that fear, it can open up the possibility for inquiry and for asking questions and reading. And goodness gracious, there's been tons written on this subject for millennia. So it creates possibility.
Death has been around for a long time. Yeah.
2 questions. And so to close off the moderated conversation part of the evening, before we go to question and response, how do you as individuals process the reality of your own mortality and death?
You check the yes box.
Yeah, I check the yes box. I've been checking the yes box since I was a little kid. I'm pretty comfortable talking about it. And I think theologically, having a framework, being raised in a tradition that gives meaning to life, that doesn't stop at physical death, right? The Kierkegaardian notion of death as a threshold, I think has resonance with me. Have I ever died? No. Do I know what awaits me? No. But is the possibility of, C.S. Lewis in the last of the Chronicles of Narnia, the non-chronological version, it talks about, he has this description of the sort of, I don't even know, is it heaven or the new heavens, right, and new earth, as being just like the most beautiful thing that you ever seen on earth, but only better, right? There's this sort of way in which it's a great story. It's a great story, and it has resonance, and so I think that I would, one of the places in which we can sit with our discomfort with death, we can ask, is there a more compelling story? I think that's a question worth considering.
When I think about mortality, I guess I tend to focus more on other people's death than mine. So in the political scale, and I think, what a leader kind of sends their citizens to die, for their own, on poor grounds when it's not an honorable war. I think about their mortality, and I think about the political significance of that. When I think about, the killings at the hands of the police and the perversity of that, and what it means to have a sort of large-scale kind of disregard for life in those contexts. Then I think about the people close to me, and I think about their death a lot more than I think about mine.
You're avoiding.
Those things are very important, I think, and perhaps it's easier, and perhaps they're doing the same for me. Maybe they'll think about me, and I'll think about them, and it'll all come out even. Yeah, but